I mean, you talked about change facilitators. I still, actually, maybe if I just go to this, which I'll just quickly, it's just a little bit of poetry by Rumi. Move with the entirety and with the tiniest particular, be the moisture in an oyster that helps to form one pearl.
Yep.
That is the summary of the change agent's work. And often people who are working in this business of change have got, in their own history, something that they're resolving and trying to include and integrate. And it's not always obvious what that is. And we love things to be whole. So there's something about the work of a change agent which is trying to sort of include everything such that the organisation can move on to the next, to where it wants to move on to. And that's the work. So there's something about being that, the moisture in the pearl, to allow that to happen.
Yeah.
And I think increasingly over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, that's going to be about helping organisations to become more adaptable, more responsive to their own experiments.
Welcome to episode 39 of the Inner Game of Change podcast, where I focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing and enabling organizational change. My name is Ali Jaman, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast. Today I'm thrilled to chat with Esther Cameron, author of Making Sense of Change Management book, consultant and a thought leader focused on revisioning change management in these strange times. In today's episode, Esther and I tackle many topics from her book, as well as the current trends and practices that are shaping the trajectory direction of change management practice. I am grateful to have Esther chatting with me today. So Esther, thank you so much for your time and welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast. Great your time to join me here and share your thoughts with me today.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. I've listened to quite a few of your podcasts and you've had some awesome guests. So I'm very happy to be invited.
Thank you very much. And before we start talking about a wonderful piece of work, Making Sense of Change Management book, and which I think you've started writing the first edition, 19 years ago?
19 years ago, yeah.
19 years
unbelievable. Where did that time go?
And you are starting the edition number 6, I think, this year.
That's right.
You're gonna start, yeah, fantastic. But before we really have a chat around the key takeaways and the key points we want to discuss, it will be wonderful to introduce yourself to my audience.
Okay, well, I'm Esther Cameron, and I'm the author of that book, Making Sense of Change Management, a co-author with Mike Green. I've been 30 years in the change field, which feels like a long time. And I started in IT, so I started as an IT project manager, and then got interested in training project managers, and then got interested in training people around change. So the idea that people were building a lot of IT systems and often they were just left in the box. This was quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
With people just, what is that IT system for? We don't even know why it's been created. So the idea that change processes were not well thought through. And so that really interested me. And then I got involved in teaching on an MSc program, partly because of that, experience of my IT background, and then got into consulting, coaching. And so over the years, I've worked in many different sectors and in many different cultures. And the book has been, because it's now in its 6th edition, for me has been a really nice reflective process every couple of years to update it in the light of experience. So I felt very fortunate that way. Of course, it's not just 30 years that I've been involved in change, but my whole life, like everybody, has been influential. And my background is that I'm from quite a straight-laced Scottish family where there were lots of taboos and undiscussables, and learnt as a child and then as a teenager about how when you bring things into the open and discuss them in an adult way, that things change and usually for the better. So there's a release and a kind of growing up that happens. And so that's been central to my work, is the power of conversation to change things. I've always been interested in maths and music. That's what I studied. I studied those two subjects. And so there's something about the beauty of a really complete system where all the parts are included.
Yes.
And so that pleases me when everything is there and everything is included.
Yes.
And there's some kind of beautiful form too, which you can feel sometimes in organisations. And now as my kids are leaving home, we were just chatting about kids earlier on, that's a huge change, my goodness, the whole business of letting go. It's not very much fun. And ageing, So I'm 63, and just allowing that process has been an education. So it feels like, one is always learning. The real process of change in your life is the most educational, I think.
And change,
Yes.
change is synonym with growth, by the sound of it.
Yeah. Yes, and I think understanding that impermanence, that nothing is here forever.
Yes.
It's part of growing, and then allowing that is what helps you to grow.
Fantastic. Well, welcome. And yes, maybe for another time, another date, we talk about the conversation of letting go. I am preparing myself. I'm training. He's just turned 13, so I think I've got a few years.
Well, the process is very good of being a teenager, because after a while you think you can't wait to let them go. Pushing all your boundaries to the limits, and go.
That is the urgency. Yes, that's the urgency around the change. Yes. So
sort of tension grows,
So talk to me about the title, Making Sense of Change Management. Well, first of all, it's a bit of a cheeky question. Have you made sense of it, Esther?
That's a very good question. It feels like just absolutely an ongoing question. So in that way, it feels like a very good title. We argued with the publishers about the word management. So we didn't particularly want management in there. We just wanted making sense of change, which I think is the actual question of the book. The reality is that in organisations, you do have to manage change. So we conceded.
Yeah, so that's another conversation again for another time. Well, perhaps we can cover it actually, because there's always the talk that are we really change managers, or we change facilitators or enablers? And so again, it's a critical question. At some stage, some organizations are actually even avoiding the whole thing, and some of them primitively call the practitioners change coordinators. And so one of the questions that I was going to ask you about some stage, but since we're talking about it now, I would like to ask about it. You've been in the business or in the game for a long time. I'm really keen to understand from you, how do you see our role in the next 5 to 10 years? Our role, we are a service delivery practice. So if organizations within the context of society change, then we're going to have to adjust to that and maybe upgrade our tools, our ways of thinking to help those organizations. What's your take on that?
Well, yes, let's head into that big question. And that feels like an enormous question. That is, that's the question that I'm heading into in this latest edition. And yes, it's a fantastic question. And I suppose, I mean, you talked about change facilitators. I saw, actually, maybe if I just go to this, which I'll just quickly, it's just a little bit of poetry by Rumi. Move with the entirety and with the tiniest particular, be the moisture in an oyster that helps to form one pearl. So somebody sent me that a few months ago, and I thought, actually, that is the summary of the change agent's work. And often people who are working in this business of change have got, in their own history, something that they're resolving and trying to include and integrate. And it's not always obvious what that is. And we love things to be whole. So there's something about the work of a change agent which is trying to sort of include everything such that the organisation can move on to the next, to where it wants to move on to. And that's the work. So there's something about being the moisture in the pearl to allow that to happen.
Yeah.
And I think increasingly over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, that's going to be about helping organisations to become more adaptable, more responsive to their own experiments, and more innovative and creative. Obviously, there's some organisations which are in stable contexts, and it doesn't apply quite so much. But most of us are in contexts which are rapidly changing and in some form of collapse in some way. That's contested, but I don't think those contests are valid. I think there's plenty of collapse around us, which feels like discontinuity. So having, hierarchical organisations where change managers support, change projects is just not the way that it's going to be in the future. I think organisations are going to become less boundaried, more localised, more flexible. That has to happen, partly because what's happening with the planet, partly because what's happening with the underlying financial and economic system. It's much more limited than we thought, and far too sort of, I'm trying to think of the word, connected in a much too rigid way. Things need to be much more flexible. I think part of the change manager's role is going to be to see that happening, that bigger change from a paradigm that we have at the moment, which is hierarchical, linear, reductive on the whole, to a paradigm which is much more flexible and more about living systems and, a regenerative way of adapting and, not squandering resources, not exploiting each other. Yeah, sorry, I'm going into a bit of...
No, it's...
extreme now, but...
the way I look at it, and I am in the middle of it over the last couple of years, I allowed myself to be less attached, to try to, harness the whole thing into a structure. First of all, it was going to be challenging for me. It will add more stress to the people around me. But also it's not going to be really useful for the client. And so I decided to start working on myself. And the way I looked at it, and you talked about it, as you look at the whole thing as a dynamic whole, keeps moving, and that movement is necessary. So I look at it as an organization, and I think in your book also you touched on that. You look at it at an organizational level. A system, the culture, the individuals, the context where we're actually playing as well. And these are not really easy things to do. Unfortunately, when you've got a project attached to a timeline, this is what spoils the whole game for us, because those timelines, unfortunately, they are selected sometimes not based on logic, just because somebody decided that they actually need to happen. But I found out that even with that, I need to work within those constraints. And the other point that I've taken up golf recently, which is really doing my head in, but I'm challenging myself to learn. And the way I look at it, having a driver and a putter is not enough, is no longer going to be enough to take the organization to the future and be a positive contributor to the organization. We need few more clubs to help with the different situations, because the environment is really dynamic. In a sport, they call it the playing conditions are always going to be different. And no matter what plan I'm going to have, I'm going to have to show a level of flexibility in the plan so I can keep adjusting to the environment.
So, that's so much the core of the challenge of change work I've found over the years, is that you have to have some form to it. So, like you say, your clients will want to, we need this done by the end of the year. Yeah. And you might be thinking as a change agent, like, oh, God, good luck. That's never going to happen. But something could happen, which might be more fundamental and will get you sort of 90% of the way there. So it's like, as an experienced practitioner, that change just doesn't happen in a linear way where you do this, and this, and this, and then it adds up to that. It's like you crack something which is absolutely fundamentally in the way of this change happening, and then, suddenly there's a lot of energy for what needs to happen.
Yes.
And so it's always in the contracting with clients, and people working inside organisations will know this as well. You have to phase the work to give that comfort to clients, because they're taking the responsibility for what's happening in their organisation. It's not us that takes that. And within that have, iterative loops where you're sensing and getting responses like, did that work? Yes, that seems to have shifted something. And that's the art of working with clients, isn't it? Where you're sort of trying to do both. And you're trying not to put them in a position where they're just like, oh my God, this is going to fail. Because it's their careers and their mortgages, and and yet there might need to be some failure, like in golf, where you just have to muck it up occasionally and try things out, and you're just going to lose on that round.
Yeah,
if you don't try, you're never going to find out.
Oh, in golf, yes.
Yes, but in organisations as well,
well, there are a lot of parallels in sport anyway. I think to your point, to be able to have the client listening to you and paying attention to your strategies and why this particular strategy would need to be modified and why they would need to listen to your question around the timeline. Because I'm working on a whole ecosystem program now with the client. And so last year they decided there's a number of projects that are going to happen on each quarter, and that's fine. So it was my job over the last 2 weeks that I put the whole picture together for them. And putting that picture, now they see that, 50% of our projects are going to go live in quarter 4. And quarter 4, really, that's in the middle of December, which means resource-wise, you're gonna struggle. People are not going to be there. So now, because I've showed them the whole picture, now I've come up with a list of suggestions for them. So now we've gone back to the prioritization piece. But I won't get a seat at the table, Esther, unless I have credibility and I take responsibility for my plan. Because as you mentioned, they rely on me and they have trust that I'm going to lead them and help them through that. At the end of the day, they are the decision makers. But these are almost like a professional and a moral obligation that we need in an appropriate way. I think you talked around how to influence. And so I always think that a change practitioner is in the business of relationship building and influencing. And because that's exactly what we do. And so unless we get the experience, unless we put things and present them and try to influence, if we just follow the normal thing, we're just going to do training and send a couple of emails for the communication and the project is going to go and finish on time, and I go and move on to another client or contract, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
It's interesting what you say about influence, because it feels like what you've done in that example you've just spoken about is hold up a mirror to the situation. Mm-hmm. You said, look, I've just mapped the whole thing out for you so you can see that this, we've got a resource problem and I'm looking at these options, and my gut feel is that that's going to be the right way forward. So that, yes, it's your credibility and your mirroring. See, what I'm wondering about is so often working in situations where what you're trying to do is encourage the leaders to partner with you.
Yes, I am a partner. You're right. Yes.
Yeah. So that it doesn't feel like you're, getting out of kilter authority-wise. And so the influencing is more subtle. It's more showing them that actually, if you map out the whole thing, that's a really good thing to do.
Well,
it's so interesting how in organisations people get so focused on the small bits and getting stuff done, and they're under pressure. Just to sit back is something I always resist pushing and influencing. But when you open things up, people will see something different. And then they have to have that sort of struggle where they then think, okay, I'm going to join you in that.
Well, that's the way I see the role will evolve into, which is I'm a partner, I'm an advisor. At the end of the day, it's your decision. And whatever decision you're going to make, I'll help you make it happen. But you often hear people saying stakeholder assessment and impact and all of that. And so what I've done, what I do in contracts where I know my role and I know my mandate and my responsibilities, there are managers that I present the whole forest picture to, and there are managers that I offer part of the picture, depending on where they sit in the hierarchy. And so if you keep feeding those pieces of information at a local level and at a global level, when it comes to a discussion around prioritization, it's not a strange thing for me to talk about this, because I've already fed them lots of information at the helicopter level before. And so the conversation becomes easier, but I've done the hard work already before. And that's what I hope our practice will evolve going forward. But unless you build the credibility, and the credibility is based on evidence and capability and showing me as a result of this, the business has succeeded or the customers have gained something. We've got a doctor here. His name is Dr. Fuda. He said, and I remember this for the last 20 years, change is not the goal. The goal is the goal. And so if I change a system, that's not the goal. The goal is actually, as a result of the change in the system, the organization has actually progressed and moved from A to B. So that's what I said in terms of what I think we should be really moving towards. And I'm hoping you're going to cover that in your 6th edition, Esther.
I think I'm just looking at my map on the wall here so thinking like a little bit further ahead to when organizations are maybe getting better at adapting and being responsive to their customers and allowing a little bit more self-organization. The role of the change manager does change. And so it doesn't invalidate what you were saying about how you have to build credibility, and there's an importance in helping influence where leadership is going. But what if that top down was less the way that organisations were working? What's the change agent doing then? And so I've got some headings here, like a big question for me is what is a business? What is it even doing? What's its intended purpose? There's a sense which, younger people working in organisations are often feeling disturbed or upset about what the organisation is doing and under-consulted, about maybe new ways of doing things or what's morally right. So that needs to change. That will change. I mean, there's quite a lot of power in, people under 40 wanting organisations to change and be more adaptive and responsive to what's going on in the world. So it feels like that's a big thing. But also I think maybe something that you're alluding to is like our evolution as human beings. So how we work with self-organisation. So it can be a bit hair-raising if you're used to working in a hierarchy to set some hard rules, agree an intention, and then allow people to, have the necessary exchanges and find their way with that. That for some people, that's a really new way of working because we're so used to linearly, year on year, quarter on quarter, delivering against targets. So that is going to have to change because that's too rigid for what's coming. There's a big evolution around that we all need to start experimenting with.
In your book, yes, I've got a couple of questions for you, but in your book, I think you did mention that, and we just, I think, touched on it as well. There's going to have to be a level of framework, whatever that is, but within that, there's going to have to be a built-in flexibility. So it's like almost you can swim between the two flags, do whatever you want to do within the two flags, but the reality is at some stage there's going to have to be a start and an end to something so you can take advantage of it. But I want to talk about, there's a lot of talk around that change is difficult, people resist change in the workplace and all of that. So how do you marry this with the new workforce, or people under 40? They really like the change happening within society. They push the agenda for change. They change governments for change. Should we see this reflected in the workplace? And does that make change management an easier task or a different task, or is this part of the evolution?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can think of a couple of examples where that's been a very positive thing. That I'm being a bit over rigid about this, people under 40, but there does seem to be a pattern there. I heard of an organisation quite recently where the senior leaders wanted young enterprising leaders to go on a program that was about regenerative leadership, to learn about it. So there's a whole set of ideas and principles around how that works to be a regenerative leader. So in tune with the planet, in tune with living systems. And what happened, there was a sort of near revolution in this program where all the younger folks said, it's not us who needs to learn about regenerative, it's like these executives. So it ended up being a presentation by that younger cohort to the execs, which was facilitated by the people who come to do the training. And so just a big conversation about what on earth are we doing as a company? Why are we doing that? How come we're not doing this? We need to look at that. So it was a revolution for them. So that actually worked very well for them, but it wasn't the way they had intended it. And I think that is happening. I've heard of a number of cases of that happening where big conversations are happening and there's a lot of listening because younger people are impatient for change, and I think rightly so. And I saw some statistics recently which talks about people's perspectives. It's often talked about moving from being left-wing to right-wing in your politics. As you grow up, you get a house and you start being a bit like, okay, yeah, maybe I need to be a bit more grown up about my politics. But that shift is not happening so much. People are left-wing and then staying left-wing, over the age of 40, because you can see how caring about the whole and caring about diversity is actually just blooming good sense. It's not really a question of whether you're young or old or naive or you've got a house or not. It's a question of actually what's going to work for us.
Yes.
So I think that naturally will happen with, if change facilitators really are brave enough to facilitate those difficult conversations, which often are the ones, with the most tension, which sometimes managers want to sort of squash down and say, like, your job. I've heard that said to me, your job is to make this go away.
Yeah.
Whereas actually the job of a change facilitator is to make it visible. What is that tension? And let's hear those perspectives. And maybe it's even a paradox that we need to manage. And maybe the answer is a bit of both.
And make it an easier conversation. There's a lot of safety in the room when you have those conversations. And you were right. I have facilitated those. But the only thing that helped me be in that position was actually always, I've done two things that actually helped me. And maybe I was focusing a lot on let's just call them progressive generation. I was focusing more. I worked with an organization where half of them were of that particular age. So then my communication strategies, I wasn't really focused more on linking the change to the strategy. I was linking the change to the purpose of the organization. And that was an easier conversation. But I was very clear that I can help the senior managers, but I can never allow them to outsource their responsibility and have those conversations themselves.
Yeah, that sounds like that could be really helpful.
Yes, yeah. I am keen to hear about your objective of writing the 6th edition. And the other question I want to ask you about is that how would you like the change practitioners to use your book? Is it a reference book? Is it a knowledge? What is it? So let's start with that question, Esther.
Yeah, let me start there. So when we first wrote the book, my colleague Mike and I were both teaching postgraduate change programs, MSCs. He was teaching at a school called Henley and I was teaching at the University of Bristol. And there just wasn't a book that had all these frameworks and models in it. And so we thought, well, let's write it because we've got all these bits of paper and bits and pieces that we were putting in notes, but let's put it together. So we never really thought of it as a book that anybody would just read the whole lot of. I mean, I think people rarely do that, but a book that combines enough about practice and enough about theory to be that book where, it's like to use the book as if you've got a friend who is just a bit ahead of you and has done this work for a long time. And, you could say, oh, God, I'm really stuck. What framework am I going to use for this meeting I've got? Or how am I going to think about that? You could just open it up and go, oh, of course, yes. And that it would be sort of familiar, but like a reminder of all the things that you've seen, all in one place. So that was the idea. And I came up with this word the other day of collage. Do you remember at school you used to do collage?
Yes.
I remember thinking, what is this? It's just sticking bits together.
Yes.
It's rubbish.
Yeah.
Actually, I was just looking at, there was a program recently on the telly about an artist called Sonia Boyce, and she said multiculturalism is collage, and she makes these amazing things. I thought, yeah, organisational change is collage because there's, we think that there's incredible coherence, but actually there's all sorts of little pockets of culture, then there might be some kind of coherence, but that's in the picture. So what, I think change agents are often putting a bit of this and then taking something that's already in the organisation, like their leadership model, we'll put that in, and then something that somebody said that you think, oh yeah, that's got a sense of direction. And then the purpose that they had 5 years ago that they put in a cupboard, which you have a feeling does actually resonate, put that there.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of helping them, get that mix such that, yeah, I mean, that's just life. It's kind of messy. So that's another way I like people to use it, is to make, because every change agent, I think, has their own history and their own uniqueness, and maybe some of their own favourite models, and that's fine. And then they're always sensing into the organisation, okay, what's going to fit here? What's going to work for people? What are their histories? What's going to open something up? So it is a really sort of active, just like art.
Absolutely. Look,
rigorous.
The way I use your book, and I've used it so many times, and it's almost like if I get stuck on a point and I need more point of views on it, it's like it's a virtual question in my head. What would Esther say about this? And I've gone to the book quite a few times over the last few years when I need extra information on another point of view from somebody else who's written about it, and with references and also practical examples as well. Because sometimes we either need validation, because sometimes we work on we work solo, we work on our own, and so how do you check? What's your touchstone? If you are part of a team, working on one job, then you can ask for help. But if you are part of a project team, and my job is pretty defined, I can have a discussion, but at the same time, I would like to hear somebody else from the arena, a specialist in the field, to actually read about their view. So that's how I use it. And
great. Well, I'm glad it's helpful.
Absolutely. And then you just mentioned something really interesting, which is I'm going to have a guest very soon, and we're going to talk about the diversity in the workplace. Very quickly, because that's going to add another complexity to manage the change or facilitate the change in the workplace. What do you think the impact will be, or is already, on organizations to have a collage of cultures within an organization? Will it make it easier?
Perfect. I think it's perfect. Well, it doesn't necessarily make it easier if you're operating in a sort of mechanistic, hierarchical way where you sort of think somehow that there's a kind of normal. So the normal looks like this, looks like, the usual white European male. That's all breaking down now. And I think, there's three principles really of complex adaptive systems and self-organization. So one is to have a good container that we've been talking about, purpose, frameworks. And one is to have diversity. You absolutely must have it. And for too long, organizations, certainly in certain parts of the world, have been not doing that. I mean, that is the way that you get change, is, get sufficient diversity for the context. Otherwise, you are going to ossify. The other principle is transforming exchanges. So that that diversity gets to know itself. What they call agent-on-agent interaction. So all the bits of that diversity get. I think the only problem that comes is when lines are drawn. Boundaries start to come up between groups, and that always needs to be looked at and worked with, because unless there's a good mix, of course you have to have certain boundaries, but you want the boundaries to be around a team that's working on something together, and then you want to have that for them to have interaction with the system that they're sitting in. So that might be kind of a naive answer, but I'm all for it. I think that is the only way that you do get healthy change, is by having diversity and having what we call redundancy. We always think in organisational terms like we don't want any redundancy because that's just wastage. But actually, some redundancy is a good thing. It's part of resilience. So having more than you need, which, the organisations almost never want to do. And I understand all the reasons, but it does mean in the longer run, you're not resilient.
Yes. Yep. Definitely the point around organization is going to have to be in such a position now. When we talk about organization, we're actually talking about the leaders would need to encourage collaboration and an organization working together rather than a siloed approach. We know the silos are not going to work. every organization suffers because of silos. But the point of diversity, again, will add, I hope leaders will use that as a leverage to actually open up those silos, and encourage those collaboration activities. Even though after the collaboration, people go back to their units, and that's fine. But I think if you do that on a regular basis, you do create a different culture, because culture is all of those habits, all of those messages, all of those behaviors are actually encouraged. That's how you really come up with, that's how culture is created.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it does take, in hierarchical organizations, it does take effort from managers to create those forums where people can really get to know each other across those boundaries. And of course, you always have, affinity boundaries, and that's fine.
Yeah.
We all like the familiar.
Yeah.
But you need to work to make those conversations happen. And I have seen that really change fundamentally in companies where, it was easy to sort of collapse into affinity boundaries or functional boundaries and just feel like you're in your own little bubble.
Yeah, of course. And of course, you have to have boundaries around the responsibilities, but the purpose should be the joining force for an organization. It's like soccer, football, Esther. The role of the goalkeeper is not their job. Their real job is not really to stop the ball from going to the goal. That's what they do. But the job of the goalkeeper and the striker and the midfielder and the coach and the massage people and the water people and everybody else is to help the team win. That is the purpose. What you do,
and even beyond that, I mean, we could have another podcast all about football.
Absolutely, yeah, and
very interesting.
Yeah,
but even beyond that, if you have a manager who's really interested in the players growing as humans, and in the community of the fans, so there's something bigger happening as well as playing the beautiful game. That you can see how that that creates something else, which is of huge value, and that is that you've got functioning and a joyous community of people who. Even when you lose, it's like,
well,
still,
the
players are growing, and
I'll take you up on that. Actually, I'd like to do that, and because it does impact the psyche of a society, and I'm talking from experience. The teams that when Messi and Argentina won, I was crying here. I was like, my son was looking at me and said, "What's wrong with this guy?" And I was happy for a few days after that. I mean, that impacted the psyche. This is, if organizations can learn one thing from those events, that will be really fantastic for people.
There's so much. So much in football.
Yeah.
I mean, Messi himself is like a subject. How he leads.
And
people writing about that. So interesting.
It's quite amazing. Yeah. One last question before I let you go. I am. We come
time already.
Yeah. What are you trying to achieve in your 6th edition, which I hope you will publish soon?
Yeah, it should be out next year if we manage to get our heads down to it. Mm-hmm. So the question for me is really the questions that we've been discussing here about, with the change management. So what do change practitioners need to pay attention to as we move into this era of more instability, where understanding complex adaptive systems and how you work with them is going to be incredibly useful. So that's where my focus is at the moment. So, I mean, not only understanding complex adaptive systems, but again, I'm just consulting my chart, but also about organizational design. There's so many interesting things going on about designing organizations in a way which loosens that boundary that goes on. So, things like IT platforms that enable people to communicate in different ways.
Working from home. Yeah. Work from home. It's a hybrid workplace now.
Yeah, so that totally changes.
Yep.
And when you have a really good platform to enable that, it makes all the difference. All the difference. I think the other things about community, and again, working from home demands that we get better at being in community and sometimes online in community. So get better at sitting in a Zoom, which has got 20 people in it, and showing up and listening and not switching off and trying to be present. So you're in here in your own room with your walls and your gravity, and then other people are in different time zones. So being in that community and understanding what that's for. So it might be for exchanging ideas, or it might be for actually working on something very closely together. Bringing a slightly different presence depending on what's happening. So those are all new skills for people.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying we're going to cover exactly how to do that, but they're big questions that we all need to hold. Like, how do we do that better? How do we facilitate those communities better? How do we be part of them? So and then the question of us growing as humans is a big one. How do we do that? How do we give up ideas of constant growth of organisations and think a bit more about regenerative ways of working that serve the planet and serve each other, in our quest to become, more integrated whole humans. And that actually does serve business in the long run, being more collaborative. It will serve business, and there's plenty of modelling that shows that is likely to be much more successful than current ways of operating.
And I hope the change practice community will be able to help organizations do a good change, a positive change.
So it's quite a big job. I think it's a very trusted community of change practitioners, and there's a lot of integrity in that group of people. I feel very respectful of, the readers of the book. We've all got quite a big job on, I think.
Fantastic. Look, to add to that, I do focus now on a principle called the change experience. As a result of this change and all the stuff that I do to help an organization and a client, at the end of the day, it's almost like you do an empathy mapping to it. How do I feel at the end of the day about the change experience? So you go to a cafe and you can get a coffee, but the whole experience is miserable. I can have good coffee, a miserable experience, but which one lasts longer? And so my focus has been over the last couple of years that when a client works with me and then they work with their people, I want to test and keep an eye and keep a finger on the pulse around their change experience. So this is separate from competency and adoption and all of those things. And I believe that as a result of the change experience, it directly impacts employee engagement because there's a care factor involved in that. But if I just roll out a change without any care, without just according to a time frame, then why would an employee be engaged with me? I didn't care really about them. And so that, again, goes back to your point around if it's going to be self-organizing organizations, and that principle will evolve with time. So change experience will really be important, especially around retaining talent within an organization. And
I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it.
And for example, I'm pushing now for the organizations I work with is that when they have an employee engagement survey or whatever they do every year, I do have in there a change experience component. And because at the end of the day, and I may be oversimplifying it, a leader comes every day to work to do what? To help their people succeed, right? That's really their job. And so how do they help them succeed? They make decisions. And those decisions are translated into changes. And then the changes become projects, and then we implement them and we make the changes. And so everything revolves around that change experience at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's a really good focus.
Yes.
Because that is where, that's where the alchemy happens. Because if you're implementing a change that you don't believe in, or, your relationship with your manager is sour, it affects everything.
And I haven't
More people are properly engaged and treated as, the intelligent humans they are, have a better experience. It's true.
Yeah, you're right. I haven't invented this. This is a combination of my thinking around everybody's can make a phone. But how do you feel about that experience when you have an iPhone in your hand? How do you feel about an experience? Uber focuses a lot, especially at the start, on the experience. How do you create that an Uber experience? How do you create a Starbucks experience? All of those things. And then so we're going to have to translate all of that into the change that we're actually doing, because it's actually a long term. But we are coming to the end of the podcast. Thoroughly enjoying this, and thank you so much.
I love the conversation. My change experience has been excellent. Thank you. No, really, I've really enjoyed talking to you. It's been very stimulating.
Thank you so much.
Great work.
Thank you so much for joining the Inner Game of Change podcast. Really grateful for your time, Esther, and best of luck. And look, I'd like to connect with you on a couple of other topics at some stage this year. Definitely. And how would people reach you, Esther?
They can contact me on LinkedIn. That's probably the simplest way for most people. Just find me and connect, or that's probably the best way. Sorry, I hadn't thought about that. I should be more on it.
You'd better answer this question properly. Where do they get a copy? How do they get hold of a copy of your book?
Well, I guess I should say go to the Kogan Page website. That's the publisher's website. And then,
excellent. Yeah.
Or, anywhere it's available.
And
I'm not going to say Amazon. Oh, no, I said it.
I'm not going to tell you where I bought it from. We're going to put all the information on the podcast. It's been a pleasure having you in my podcast, Esther. Really thoroughly enjoying this.
Thank you for inviting me.
Grateful for your book. Helped me a lot in sticky situations. It even made me well-versed in mergers and acquisitions. So there you go.
Very good.
Thank you so much for your time. And until next time, stay well and stay safe.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. To know more about my guests and this podcast, check the innergameofchange.com.au website. And remember to subscribe. I can't wait to share with you my next podcast. Until then, stay well and stay safe.